Before I introduce Professor Daniel Greene, I just want to thank a couple of people. We've partnered in bringing Professor Greene in for really a 3-day visit, a Zoom visit that's going to involve graduate student training and is going to involve another event on Friday. And we were able to do this with the collaboration of Professor Kathy Brosnan, who is here with her doggie, and she really took the initiative on this one. So I want to thank Kathy, and also the very fine economist Georgia Cosmopoulou, who is also the Associate Dean of Research at OU. And I guess the three of us mainly got together, and we were going to originally bring Daniel in real life, but here he is. And so we're very glad that Professor Greene can join us. Before I introduce him formally, which won't take long, I'll just say that I have only recently reread his first book, The Jewish Origins of Cultural Pluralism, which is just a fantastic study of the Menorah Association and its role in American diversity. That's not what he'll be speaking about today, although I wanted him to. And but it's a terrific book, and he's done many things since then. So, Professor Daniel Greene is the president and librarian at the Newberry Library in Chicago. He's also a professor of history at Northwestern University. Professor Greene curated Americans in the Holocaust, an exhibit that opened in 2018 at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Professor Greene is also currently editing a primary source reader, Americans in the Holocaust, to be published by Rutgers University Press in 2021. Rona will tell you it's a pretty good press. His book, The Jewish Origins of Cultural Pluralism, I mentioned it won the American Jewish Historical Saul Wiener Prize. He's also the co-author of Homefront, Daily Life in the Civil War, University of Chicago, 2013. And he's been a distinguished lecturer at the Organization of American Historians, and he's just been active as a scholar, curator, researcher, mentor for many scholars over really now the last few decades. And I just couldn't be more delighted to welcome Professor Greene. And I'm going to put myself on mute, and hopefully, and also, I want to thank always, I'm sorry for not mentioning it, I want to thank Trice Hyman for arranging the publicity and the organizing the electronics and the Zoom features and all that. And really, we've been doing everything so smoothly, entirely thanks to Trice's work. So I'm sure he's there stage managing things. I'm going to put myself on mute and introduce Professor Greene.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks to you for inviting me to do this, and it's great to see you too, Kathy, at a distance. I'm thrilled to at least virtually be in Oklahoma for the next few days to talk not only about the exhibition I curated at the Holocaust Museum, but also about opportunities at the Newberry Library, where I'm sitting now, as well as just careers in public history. So I hope we can have a good 3 days together, and I really appreciate the invitation. I'm going to share my screen. The talk that I'm giving today is based on an exhibition that opened at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. in April of 2018. And so I'm going to pull in a lot of the visuals from that exhibition. I hope that you can all see this now. Thumbs up. Thanks, Alan. Okay, and let me start by saying a few things just about framing this topic. This is a challenging topic to address with many misconceptions. A lot has been written about Americans' response to Nazism. I think, and one of the kind of our subject position as we were working on this from the Holocaust Memorial Museum was that not enough had been written about it with deep attention to American history and American context. So part of the goal of the project was to challenge myths and misconceptions about this history and to bring a U.S. history perspective to understanding how Americans responded to Nazism. In part, this, for those of you who know, for example, Samantha Power's work, her book, A Problem from Hell, which looks at the U.S. government's response to multiple genocides over time, she argues that it's often we misunderstand Americans' response to genocide if we only look at a foreign policy context, that we have to look at a domestic context. And the other approach, which is very much in keeping with the Holocaust Memorial Museum's approach over 25 years, is to ask difficult questions about this history, not to try to deliver a package that gives viewers or exhibition visitors all the answers, but prompts difficult questions and prompts them to want to learn more. So questions like, what did Americans know? When did they know it? But then a much more difficult question asking what more could have been done. And the one of the key takeaways, and you know, this exhibition, of course, is not primarily for specialists in the field. It's for visitors to the museum on the National Mall, many of whom are high school and college students. So much like the populations that many of you are teaching. Of course, we knew a lot. We had, or at least it's fair to say that Americans had access in real time to a lot of information about the threat of Nazism, including the persecution and murder of Europe's Jews by the 1940s. And we did a lot of surveying of high school students and college students at the beginning of this project as a team. And one of the things that we learned was that most people, the majority of respondents to the surveys, actually thought that Americans didn't have much information about the threat of Nazism. So that was one of the baselines that we were trying to overturn. And it actually, once people understand how much information Americans had access to, it actually leads them to a much more difficult question. If we say, oh, well, Americans didn't know anything, and so our response was less vigorous than it could have been, that in a way lets Americans off the hook. If visitors come through the exhibition and they realize, wow, Americans had access to a great deal of information in real time as it was happening, so why didn't rescue of Jews become a priority? That's a harder question, and it's a question that we try to take on in multiple ways during the exhibition, casting widening the aperture on American society, not only looking at the U.S. government, but looking at American society much more broadly than that. And then we were also motivated by asking some enduring questions about Americans' response to genocide that we take up in the 1930s and 40s, but that can be answered, but that can be asked about Americans' response to other genocides as well. Questions like, how do Americans respond when they see a democracy fall apart abroad? Questions like, how do Americans debate their responsibilities to admit refugees or to keep refugees out? Once Europe goes to war in 1939, how do Americans debate the responsibility to either enter this war or stay out of war? And then finally, once we learn about the final, what the Nazis call the final solution, which Americans know about by 1942, how do they debate their responsibility to intervene on behalf of the victims of Nazism? And there were two important gaps that we thought about frequently in putting this exhibition together. I've already been saying multiple times now that we had access to a lot of information, but we wanted visitors to think about the gap between information and understanding. Americans were living through this, they didn't have the benefit of hindsight that we have now on this history. And what does it mean to then try to empathize with what Americans knew at the time? And I'll talk about that at a few points along the way. So that was one gap, this gap between information and understanding. And then the second gap that we were interested in getting visitors to think about is the gap between disapproval and a will to action on behalf of the victims. We see widespread disapproval among Americans of Nazism, but that disapproval doesn't translate, for the most part, into a will to action on behalf of the victims. And we wanted people to ask why. Why that was such a hard bridge for Americans to cross at the time. So again, we try throughout the exhibition to bring a rich American history context to understanding Americans' response to Nazism, and that starts with understanding the context before 1933. And especially thinking about what it was like coming out of World War I. In the United States. If you asked Americans in the 1930s, was it a mistake to enter World War I, which Gallup did, usually it was about 7 in 10 Americans who said yes, it wasn't worth it. Here you see an American veteran of World War I on the street wearing a placard that says, I gave my eyes. You would have seen scenes like this throughout the United States, visiting graves of fallen World War I soldiers. And again, many Americans just thought that they wondered whether that intervention had been worth it. And we're a deeply isolationist nation before 1933, before Hitler rises to power. We are all but closed to immigrants. Many of you know this history of a series of restrictive immigration laws, culminating in a 1924 law known as the Johnson-Reed Act that sets quotas on the number of immigrants or the number of visas that could be issued to immigrants from mostly immigrants born in European countries. And the 1924 quota law was designed to keep out Southern and Eastern European immigrants. It was anti-Semitic in its origins. It was anti-Semitic in its intent. It's a product of a belief in the United States among policymakers in eugenic, quote, science that has a hierarchy of races and groups, and Jews sit near the bottom of that hierarchy. So those restrictive immigration laws are in place also well before the Nazis come to power in 1933. We're a xenophobic nation. Here you see the Ku Klux Klan marching near the U.S. Capitol in 1925, I believe this picture is. And the Klan, of course, is anti-Semitic. It's a virulently racist organization against African Americans, also an anti-Catholic organization. And what the Klan is trying to do, and what white supremacist organizations like this are trying to do, are draw boundaries around who can be an American and who can't. And they are going to try to enforce these boundaries in multiple ways, including horrific violence against African Americans and others. It's a segregated nation. This is North Carolina in the 1930s. American institutions are segregated. And that segregation is also enforced both through law at local levels and through extra-legal violence throughout this period. And then in 1929, the bottom of the American economy falls out. So here is this is a soup kitchen in my hometown of Chicago, actually a soup kitchen that was run by Al Capone in Chicago. By 1929, unemployment in the United States is 25%. So these are all the preconditions already existing in the United States before 1933. What I'm going to do in this talk is just stop at a few years along the way between 1933 and 1945, talk about what Americans knew and how they responded. So in 1933, we have all these preconditions in place already. We're almost 4 years or 3.5 years into significant, one of the most significant economic depressions in U.S. history. And then, of course, we look abroad and we see this, right? We see Hitler rise to power. And it shouldn't surprise us that this is a well-covered event in the American press. Americans are fascinated with Hitler. You get Hitler on the cover of multiple American magazines. This is Vanity Fair on the left 2 months before Hitler becomes chancellor. It's November of 1932. Hitler appears frequently on the cover of Time magazine, for example. And much of the coverage is about the collapse of democracy in Germany. But they don't, the reporters do not miss that anti-Semitism is central to Nazi ideology. Here's one example. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, on the cover of Time magazine, July 10th of 1933. And in case you can't see it, I've just pulled out on the right here, under the sketch of Goebbels, it says, Minister of Propaganda Goebbels, say it in your dreams, the Jews are to blame. Now, this article, it's about a 3,000-word article in Time magazine that explains to readers that the Nazi ideology is defined by anti-Semitism, that the Nazis explain the world to themselves by blaming Jews for all the ills of the world. The danger here then is looking at an article like this as a historian and saying, well, we should have known that genocide was coming, right? And that's not what we're saying in the exhibition. The Nazis didn't know in 1933 that genocide was coming. But what we should say in looking at an article like this is information was available to Americans to let them know that Nazism was driven by anti-Semitic ideology, and that Jews in Germany were already suffering from that. That's not hidden from Americans in 1933, nor did Nazis want it to be hidden from Americans or from the world in 1933. They're imagining a Europe free of Jews. They want a Germany free of Jews. They don't yet have a plan to murder all the Jews of Europe, though. That will come later. You get extended coverage like the coverage from well-known American journalist Dorothy Thompson. She writes a book in 1933 called I Saw Hitler. This is an excerpt from the book in Cosmopolitan magazine. So that, again, across sort of the middle brow of American literature at the time, she writes, anti-Semitism is the life and soul of Hitler's movement. The Nazis lose no opportunity to insult the Jews. At the same time, she underestimates Hitler. If you can see the pull quote under I Saw Hitler on the left-hand side of the magazine page, she says, when I walked into Adolf Hitler's salon, I was convinced that I was meeting the future dictator of Germany. In less than 50 seconds, I was sure I was not. She calls him a small, involuble man. She says this man is not going to rise to be the chancellor of Germany. And of course, she's wrong about that. So the portrayals of Hitler across the American press run the gamut from seeing him as truly dangerous to seeing him as a clown. And that's true in 1933, and it's also, I'll show you later, still true in 1942. The American government has representatives in Germany, of course. The State Department especially has representatives in Germany. George Messersmith, one of them, writes back from Berlin just about 6 months into the Hitler's reign and says the situation of Jews in Germany is a most deplorable one, and I see no future for them in this country. Our first ambassador under President Roosevelt is this man, William Dodd, who had been a history professor at the University of Chicago, actually, before he was sent to Germany to be the ambassador. And what Messersmith and Dodd are concerned about, in part, in the summer of 1933, is attacks on Americans in Germany by Nazis, mainly by the Nazi SA. And there are at least 36 attacks on Americans, mostly American Jews, in Germany. For example, I'm showing you the Chicago Tribune from October of 1933. In Dodd's first meeting with Hitler, the first item on Dodd's agenda is to try to stop these attacks against the physical attacks against Americans by the SA. And according to Dodd's recounting of the meeting, Hitler agrees to do that. And actually, after the summer of 1933, there's a significant decline in attacks against Americans by the Nazis. What Messersmith and Dodd do not do is try to protect Jews in Germany in any way. they see that as beyond their purview. They still write to each other about respecting another country's national sovereignty. So they're trying to protect American citizens abroad, but they don't speak up on behalf of German Jews who are already facing, of course, a great deal of persecution and danger. I'm going to skip ahead now to 1938 because everything changes or many things change in 1938 in terms of how Americans understand the threat of Nazism, in part because the Nazis annex Austria in the spring of 1938 in an event known as the Anschluss, and that is widely covered in the U.S. press, especially as deep concern that the Nazis' that Hitler has greater territorial ambitions beyond Germany. That's, of course, no secret to Americans in 1938 as it's happening, and neither is the nationwide attack against Jews in November of 1938, the November pogrom, or known as Kristallnacht. You see coverage across the United States, banner headline coverage like this. Here's the Dallas Morning News from November of 1938. Hysterical Nazis wreck thousands of Jewish shops, burn synagogues in wild orgy of looting and terror. Across the 12-year period of Nazism, from 33 to 45, Kristallnacht is the most widely covered event in the U.S. press. Even when information about what the Nazis call the final solution, even when information about the Nazis' genocidal plan becomes public in the United States in November of 1942, it's not as big a story. It's not as widely covered a story. And we can certainly talk more about why that is. Even 2 weeks after Kristallnacht, you get headlines like this in the Los Angeles Examiner: Nazis warn world Jews will be wiped out unless evacuated by democracies. Kristallnacht stays on American newspaper headlines on front pages for weeks. We start to see graphics like this. This is a graphic from an Oakland, California newspaper. Depicting the countries in Europe, and you see two numbers under each country separated by a dash. On the left-hand side, it's the estimate at that moment of this reporter of how many Jews are living in these countries at this time. And the estimates are pretty, Poland, 3.2 million, that might be a little bit low. Hungary, 444,000, Romania, nearly 1 million. Those are relative, they're not exact, but they're relatively good estimates. The Germany estimate is high for this time, 550,000, because many Jews had left Germany between 1933 and 1938. What you're seeing then on the right side is the number of immigration visas that could be issued under existing U.S. restrictive immigration law. So, for example, the U.S. government could issue 6,524 visas to Polish-born who are, and not just Polish-born Jews, to Polish-born who are trying to make it into the United States. Hungary's number is 869. Lithuania's number is 386. So the point here is these restrictive immigration quotas were in most countries a tiny percentage of the number of Jews living in these countries. And then, of course, don't misunderstand what these numbers are, what the quotas are. The U.S. government never saw these numbers as goals to achieve, right? They're limits not to exceed. So if you look at the numbers of visas that were actually issued for German-born in 1933, 34, 35, 36, it's way under the number, sometimes as low as 3% of that number, sometimes more like 10 or 15% of the total immigration visas that could be issued to European-born who are trying to make it into the United States. So it's a restrictive system already, and then within the confines of that restrictive system, the visas are being far under issued. Far fewer visas are issued than could have been even under these restrictive immigration laws. But even if all the visas had been issued, there's no way through the existing restrictive immigration process to rescue all the Jews of Europe. and there's no political will in the United States, or very little political will, no dominant political will to change our restrictive immigration system. I talked about that gap between disapproval and the will to action. I'm going to show you two Gallup polls from November of 1938, taken about 2 weeks after Kristallnacht. So Gallup asked Americans, do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? And you can see here, it's an overwhelming disapproval rate. 94% of Americans disapprove of the Nazis' treatment of Jews in Germany. And then they're asked this question at the same time, 2 weeks after the November pogrom. Should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? And more than 7 in 10 say no. And with very few exceptions, almost every time Americans are asked between 1938 and 1945 about whether we should be admitting more Jewish exiles to live, it usually falls between 67% and 75% of Americans saying no, no matter what we learn. Dorothy Thompson writes a book in 1938 called Refugees. And in that book, she says it's a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times, that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death. And here's what she's talking about. I won't read everything on this slide, but the point of this slide in showing what's required to obtain a U.S. immigration visa is that there were bureaucratic walls put in place by the U.S. State Department and the U.S. government to make it exceedingly difficult to make it into the United States. When I teach this topic, students often ask, why didn't the Jews just leave? And it's a question it's a naive question. I'm not trying to blame the students for that. The question really should be not why didn't the Jews just leave, but why did the United States make it so difficult for refugees to get in? And you can see here some of the paperwork that was required, which was expensive. Especially ship tickets were very expensive. And often documents could be acquired by people seeking refuge in the United States or in other countries with a short expiration time. They would be valid for only a short amount of time, and so the point is it's a bureaucratic nightmare. For immigrants who want to make it out, who want to make it to the United States, and it's designed by the State Department to be that way, and so it quote works to keep immigrants and refugees out at the time. One of the documents that I find really interesting is Albert Einstein himself, a refugee, wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, in July of 1941. I'll pull out a quote from this letter. He says, "A policy is now being pursued in the State Department which makes it all but impossible to give refuge in America to many worthy persons who are the victims of fascist cruelty in Europe. Of course, this is not openly avowed by those responsible for it." He's talking about those in the United States government who are responsible for it. "The method which is being used, however, is to make immigration impossible by erecting a wall of bureaucratic measures alleged to be necessary to protect America against subversive, dangerous elements." And I think that phrase, "a wall of bureaucratic measures," is so instructive that Einstein is asking Eleanor Roosevelt to address. That wall of bureaucratic measures works very effectively during this period, a period where Jews, of course, are desperate to leave Germany and other countries in Europe. Let's skip ahead to 1939. An instructive moment in 1939 is a proposal in the U.S. Congress, which is known as the Wagner-Rogers Bill. Senator Robert Wagner of New York, a Democrat, and a Republican congresswoman from Massachusetts named Edith Rogers propose to admit children. Children are defined as between the age of 5 and 14, to admit 10,000 children in 1939 and another 10,000 children in 1940, and to not count them against the restrictive immigration quotas, to put them in a special class as a humanitarian measure, to let in 20,000 children over 2 years, refugee children, unaccompanied children, without their parents. Eleanor Roosevelt speaks out about this, even though President Roosevelt himself does not. They have private conversations about whether he should speak out. He says, he writes to her at one point, "I can't, but you should." And so Eleanor Roosevelt says at one point, "I think it's a wise way to do a humanitarian act. Other nations take their share of child refugees, and it seems a fair thing to do." For those of you who know the history, for example, of the kinder transports that are going to the UK, that's coterminous with this Wagner-Rogers proposal, which is really the first half of 1939 that it's being considered. The loudest voices against the Wagner-Rogers bill are Southern white Democrats like Senator Robert Reynolds. He says at one point, "My heart goes out in sympathy to refugee children, but my heart beats in sympathy first for the American sons and daughters in preference to the children of fathers and mothers of any other nation in the world." Reynolds basically argues that there are American children who are suffering. It's still, we're even in 1939, we're not out of the woods on the Great Depression. There had been a second recession in 1937 and 1938. Unemployment is high, and there is still a strong rhetoric in the United States of those immigrants would take American jobs, even when we're talking about here, of course, we're talking about children, but some of the private conversations against the Wagner-Rogers bill say, well, 20,000 Jewish children will soon be 20,000 Jewish adults. So there's, of course, that comment is also tinged with deep anti-Semitism, and we're at a height of anti-Semitism in the United States in the 1930s as well. American public opinion is against the Wagner-Rogers bill. Americans are asked about this in January of 1939. They used 10,000 in the question because it was 10,000 a year for 2 years. It's been proposed that the government permit 10,000 refugee children be brought into this country and taken into American homes. Do you approve of this plan? And 67% say no. So the United States never has a moment like or a program like the kinder transport. It's hard to count how many unaccompanied children came to the United States during this period, but some historians estimate a fair estimate would be around 1,500 over the course of the entire 12-year period, often through heroic work of organizations like the German Jewish Children's Aid, which bring a lot of unaccompanied or a number of unaccompanied children over, but not in a U.S. government-sponsored program like this. I'm going to skip ahead to, just in the interest of time, to Europe going to war. As you all know, Europe goes to war in September of 1939 when Germany invades Poland. Here are Americans reading about bombs raining on Warsaw. England and France declare war on Germany almost immediately, and President Roosevelt takes to the airwaves for a fireside chat 2 days after the war begins. On September 3rd, 1939, Roosevelt says, "This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well." When Americans are asked in 1939 whether we should get into the war, they're asked in multiple ways. Should we send arms? Should we intervene in the war? Gallup asks a version of this question almost every week between 1939 and Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And it's in 1939, it's often about 70% of Americans are saying no, we should stay out of this war. There's a very strong isolationist movement in the United States. These signs apparently were only on the White House fence for a matter of moments, but a photographer snapped someone putting up these signs that say, "FDR, you're preparing for war, you fight it." There was rhetoric in these isolationist movements that FDR was lying to the American people and saying that we would stay out of war and that he was a warmonger who was looking for ways to get us into war. The isolationist movement coalesces around an organization known as the America First Committee. Here's a propaganda poster from the America First Committee illustrating that liberty itself will be the first casualty if the United States gets into war. The loudest spokesperson for America First is Charles Lindbergh, who's seen here at the podium right in front of the image of George Washington. Lindbergh, of course, was an American hero. He had flown across the Atlantic solo in 1927, and he starts to be an outspoken advocate for America First. He gives a notorious speech in Des Moines, Iowa on September 11th of 1941, where it's called, the speech is known as the War Agitator speech. And he says there's three groups that clearly want the United States to enter this war. The first group is the British, and he says, of course, this makes sense. The British are the last line of defense against the Nazis in Europe by September of 1941. He says the second group that wants to lead the United States to war is the FDR administration. And FDR has been lying to you, the American people, about this. He's looking for ways to get us into war, and the administration can't be trusted. And then he says the third group that wants to lead us to war are the Jews. And he acknowledges that the persecution of Jews in Europe is something that Jews are greatly concerned about and have a right to be concerned about. But then he quickly slips into some of the most recognizable anti-Semitic tropes. He says the media is sending you messages about entering this war and about intervening in this war. And let's look at who controls the media in the United States. It's the Jews. And he says, we're starting to see more and more interventionist movies come out of Hollywood. And that's because Hollywood is controlled by Jews. He starts to talk about economic interests for entering this war. The reaction to Lindbergh's speech is almost resounding, almost entirely negative across the United States. Many people begin to ask, they openly ask, is he anti-Semitic? Some people start to ask, is he a Nazi sympathizer? And Lindbergh goes quiet after this. The America First Committee only exists for about another 3 months before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And I can't prove this so there's this negative reaction to Lindbergh, and I can't prove it as a historian. There's no evidence for it, but I think what Lindbergh is doing is giving voice publicly to what a lot of Americans think at the time who want to stay out of war. One of the best responses to Lindbergh comes from a political cartoonist, Theodore Geisel, who we, of course, better know as Dr. Seuss. He's working for a New York news magazine at the time called PM, and he draws this about a week after Lindbergh's speech. You see either a parent, a mother or a grandmother wearing an America First sweater and reading a terrifying story to her children called Adolf the Wolf. And the caption reads, and the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children and it didn't really matter. So this is September of 1941, but it even harkens back to the inability to pass the Wagner-Rogers bill two years earlier, that even for foreign children, the United States doors are all but closed. I'll show you just some of the propaganda posters then that the U.S. government started to produce once we do go to war after Pearl Harbor. And the point here in looking at images like this one on the left, of Nazism being an enemy of Christianity, or on the right, a hand with a Nazi with a swastika ring crushing our sacred American documents, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, or posters like this where you see on the left a looming swastika over American children, is that Nazism is depicted, of course, as an enemy of American children, as an enemy of American democracy, as an enemy of Christianity, as an enemy of American values, but not as an enemy of Europe's Jews. Jews are not central. Jews are almost not present in the propaganda produced by the U.S. government trying to encourage Americans to go to war or trying to spur on their war efforts. Even the way we see Hitler in 1942. Here's Hitler on the cover of the New Yorker, Halloween, 1942, of course, harkening back to the Wizard of Oz movie from 1939. Hitler's depicted as the wicked which. So he's scary, but we're still poking fun at him. This is one example of many I could have chosen of poking fun at Hitler, even in 1942. And then he's also depicted as a madman. This is a wartime poster. We shall soon have our stormtroopers in America. But again, where's the threat here? The threat is Nazis on American shores. The threat is not a threat to Europe's Jews. So that threat was all but absent in American propaganda. Let's go ahead to 1942 then and ask, when did Americans learn that the Nazis, and how did they learn that the Nazis had a plan to murder all the Jews of Europe? They learned because information makes it to Gerhard Riegner, who is the representative of the World Jewish Congress in Switzerland. It makes it to him from sources in Poland that the Nazis have a plan in place, which we now know that they called the final solution to the Jewish question. This is a telegram. You can see the pencil dating on the right, 8/29/42. It's August 29th of 1942. And this is a telegram that Gerhard Riegner intended to send to, here you can see Stephen Wise, a rabbi in New York, and also the head of the World Jewish Congress organization. It says, I'm going to skip down a little, but it says, in Führer's headquarters, plan discussed and under consideration, all Jews in countries occupied and controlled Germany, number 3.5 to 4 million, should after deportation and concentration in East, at one blow exterminated to resolve once for all Jewish question in Europe. This telegram was intended for Rabbi Wise, but it didn't make it to Rabbi Wise. It's blocked in the State Department. State Department officials dismiss this as what they call one of the many unreliable war rumors that were circulating at the time. The World Jewish Congress representative, though, had also sent it to a member of parliament in England, a man named Samuel Sidney Silverman, and Silverman is able to get the information to Rabbi Wise. Rabbi Wise goes to the State Department in the late summer, early fall of 1942, speaks to the Undersecretary of State to ask if this is true, and he's told by the State Department, give us time. Give us time to confirm this. Wise agrees to that, and it takes the State Department some months to confirm this. Wise is called back to the State Department in November of 1942, and he's told that this information is true. Wise then goes to the press. He tells an AP reporter in November of 1942 of this plan. And if you picked up American newspapers on November 25th of 1942, this is again one of many examples I could have chosen. This is the Los Angeles Times. It says the headline here, Nazis wiping out Jews in cold blood. A subheadline, half of Jews in Europe is dead. The numbers aren't right, but that's not. It's not exactly the point here. The number that gets floated or that kind of captures the field in November of 1942 is 2 million. It's certainly more than 2 million Jews already had been murdered by November of 1942. But what's important is that the story is there. The outlines of the story is accessible to Americans, that Jews are being deported to points in the East to be murdered at killing centers. So even if we don't know all of the facts that of course we know today, the information is there in November of 1942. Americans again are asked about this by Gallup just 2 months later, January of 1943. It's been said that 2 million Jews have been killed in Europe since the war began. Do you think this is true or just a rumor? And as you can see here, about 48% believe that it's true. About a quarter believe it's a rumor, and about a quarter don't know how to answer this question. This is a number that will change over time. When Americans are asked by the end of 1944, the way the question is asked in the end of 1944 is, do you believe that Germans are murdering Jews in concentration camps? By that time, 76% of Americans will say yes, that they believe it's true. But then when they're asked about the number of Jews, to estimate the number of Jews who might have died, they cannot grasp the numbers. Very few Americans believe that it's over 1 million who had died. And by that point, of course, it's well over 5 million who had died. You even see throughout the war at times, again, the middle-brow American press, like Time magazine, putting Himmler on the cover of Time with a quote from the article, "Himmler and his trained Gestapo animals have organized a program of extermination without parallel." The story is the war. Of course, if you pick up an American magazine between 1942 and 1945, it's filled with war stories. Even every advertisement is about supporting the war effort almost. But every once in a while, moments like this, the story punctures through of the Nazis plan. So for Americans who were paying close attention, they certainly had access to this information. Let me just talk a little bit here at the end about then a response within the U.S. government. This is Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, who had been in Roosevelt's cabinet all the way along since 1933. And the Treasury Department, by this point, learns that the State Department had been actively obstructing information and aid about the murder of Europe's Jews. With a couple aides, Morgenthau visits Roosevelt in late 1943, takes this report to him titled Personal Report to the President. He'd actually kind of watered down the title that his aides originally put on a first draft of the report, which was the acquiescence of our government in the murder of the Jews. You can see the first line of this report, one of the greatest crimes in history, the slaughter of the Jewish people in Europe, is continuing unabated. And it speaks about the utter failure of certain officials in the State Department to take action. Roosevelt, now we're late in the war, it's January of 1944, Roosevelt issues an executive order to create a new body called the War Refugee Board. This is going to be an interagency, interdepartmental effort within the U.S. government. The War Refugee Board's charge is to rescue Jews as long as it doesn't impede the war effort. And the War Refugee Board will be headed then by a young lawyer in the Treasury Department named John Paley. And this group, which I could talk more about if you're interested, who are working within the U.S. government, use both legal and extra-legal means to try to aid Jews in Europe. One of the efforts that they undertake is to bring 982 refugees to a camp, a fort in upstate New York, in Oswego, New York, called Fort Ontario. These 982 refugees arrive in August of 1944. Most of them were Slavs who had been in Italy, and they're coming from Italy. And they're not admitted to the United States as immigrants. They're held behind barbed wire at a camp at Fort Ontario until February of 1946, well after the war, when President Truman agrees to admit them. This is the only instance during this 12-year period where the United States lets in, as a group, a mass of refugees outside of the existing immigration quota system, and it comes quite late in the war. You see here on one side of the fence a refugee talking to children in Oswego. So the boundaries of this camp become somewhat more porous over time, but this is not an admission of refugees from Nazi Germany. It's simply a holding of them at this free port. So where are we left at the end of the story? In 1945, as you know, American troops start to encounter Nazi concentration camps in Germany and elsewhere. I'm going to show you a disturbing picture now from Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald. Here we can see Eisenhower with his hands on his hips, General Eisenhower with his hands on his hips, in Ohrdruf in the second week of April of 1945, less than a month before the end of the war. One of the things that Eisenhower says when he goes to Ohrdruf is so instructive. He says, everything that's been printed to date has been an understatement. So obviously Eisenhower has access to a great deal of information, and I've been talking about the information that Americans had access to. They didn't have a great deal of visual evidence. They had some, but not a great deal of visual evidence. And so even Eisenhower and Patton, General Patton, who's with him, are profoundly shocked by what they encounter here. This is the second week of April over there, and this is the second week of April over here. Roosevelt dies during the second week of April, and Truman becomes president. And so Americans, of course, are deeply focused on the loss of the man who had been president for 12 years. We skip ahead just 1 month, and here's Americans celebrating in Times Square on VE Day, May 8th of 1945. The war against Japan, of course, will go on for another 3 months until we drop the atomic bombs. But here, Americans are celebrating their sacrifices, of which there were many, to defeat Nazism. And there's a great deal of jubilation at the end of the war in Europe. At the same time, this is Life magazine from May 7th of 1945, the day before VE Day. Americans are starting to see more visual evidence like this when they go to the newsreels, when they pick up magazines like Life magazine. This is Bergen-Belsen on the left-hand side, a young boy walking along the side of the road, and you see the bodies of victims there. On the right, you see Buchenwald. This article titled Atrocities in Life magazine actually doesn't speak specifically to Jews as the primary victims of Nazism. So that again speaks to, even though we had access to a lot of information, there's a lack of understanding of the Holocaust as a distinct event, even as we're starting to see images like this. And even 6 months after the end of the war, December of 1945, I'll leave you with this last slide. Gallup asks again about admitting refugees. They ask, should we permit more persons from Europe to come to this country each year than we did before the war? Should we keep the number about the same, or should we reduce the number? And here again, only 5% of Americans, 6 months after the end of the Holocaust and after the end of the war, say that we should be letting in more refugees. So on the one hand, American society is completely transformed by its encounter with Nazism. On the other hand, the needle doesn't move very often or very much at all on Americans' willingness to let in refugees. And that, I think, is one of the most troubling aspects of this history of thinking about our encounter with Nazism at this time.